Welcome to the final edition of the Astro Bot History Series, where I discuss every single VIP bot from Astro Bot. In this video, we're covering every character from 2013 to 2024, covering both the PS4 and the PS5. If you missed the rest of the series, then please check the description for links to those, as you probably want to check out the previous generations ahead of this one. You can also find a link to a playlist of every music track used in this series if that's something you're curious about. Before we kick off the final games, a quick reminder of how this series works. Every bot here is listed by the original character's PlayStation debut, with franchises based on the oldest character. I also welcome corrections, but please check for your correction in a pinned comment before you rush to post it. It may have already been addressed. And now, time for the final batch of bots, starting with the launch of the PS4. With the development of the PS4, Sony wanted a game that served multiple purposes. The first of these was a game that showed off the new console's advanced rendering tech that allowed it to show off a ton of small items on screen at once. The second was a family-friendly title that showed that Sony had more to offer on launch than just shooters. It was directed by Mark Cerny, an industry veteran whose experience with the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro franchises made him a suitable fit for what they were trying to achieve. That game was Knack, the first PS4 game shown to the public. It was a platformer crossed with a brawler. It starred Knack, the creation of a scientist known as Dr. Vargas, who designed an organism made entirely out of ancient relics in order to combat the evil goblin race that was threatening humanity. Due to his unique nature, he was able to fuse with relics found throughout the game, allowing him to shift in size. As a heavily promoted launch title for the PS4, and seemingly yet another attempt by Sony to create a mascot character, it's perhaps not surprising to see Knack show up in Astro Bot. He is the living relic, whose description and hit animation reference how he is made up of lots of small relics and can crumble to a smaller size when hit. There's really not a lot else to cover here, however, as Knack was poorly received on launch. Reviews were mixed and sales seemed to be boosted mostly by Japanese PS4s being bundled with the game. A sequel was made, but it failed to achieve much of note, and now Knack is largely a relic itself, mostly living on as an internet meme. Tragic. As stated, Knack was a launch title for the PS4, and since that console's library is almost entirely playable on PS5, just assume every game I mention going forward is available on PS5, unless otherwise stated. In 1993, two independent developers were formed in Finland, Bloodhouse and Terramark. Over time, the leads for both studios, Harri Tikkanen and Ilari Kuttinen, became close friends and eventually decided to merge their companies as Housemarque, the oldest known Finnish game company. Sorry, Remedy. Their first game as a combined entity was a remake of Bloodhouse's first game, Stardust, an arcade shooter. This would become a key game for them, as remakes and reworks of the game would appear frequently over the years, including Super Stardust HD, Super Stardust Portable, and Super Stardust Delta, all of which were published by Sony and exclusive to their systems. With the imminent arrival of the PS4, the team wanted to maintain their relationship with Sony and develop a new game in the same style as Super Stardust exclusively for the console. Similar to how Knack was built around the idea of multiple small objects on screen at once, this tech was also implemented into Housemarque's shooter, building the world out of voxels that could be shattered and broken as the game went on. The final game would end up being a launch title for the system, named Resogun. The gameplay was simple. You flew a ship around a 2D environment wrapped around a 3D cylinder. You shot down enemy ships that appeared in order to rack up score multipliers and free human captives. Once freed, you could collect these humans and take them to rescue points. Naturally, the game contained a wide array of power-ups to help you on your way. Resogun appears in Astro Bot in the form of the Defender ship. This is a recreation of the Ferox ship from Resogun, which is the all-rounder ship out of the three in the game, which also features in much of the game's marketing. Its gacha item is the little green men, who represent the humans that you can rescue within the game. The descriptions for both represent actions you can take involving humans. The ship description references the fact that if you shoot humans, they will bounce up into the air. where successive shots can keep them juggled, although this somehow does not cause them harm. The human's description mentions throwing them, a literal action you can take to send them to a rescue station. Resogun was a prominent launch title for the PS4, although it wasn't a huge commercial seller. However, the positive critical response led to Sony and Housemarque building an even closer relationship. Maybe we'll see more of them later in the video. While Little Big Planet was a huge success for Media Molecule, they were not a team that were willing to just sit by and rehash the same concept over and over. Creativity is at the heart of Media Molecule's existence, so it's not surprising that they would pursue new ideas that would celebrate the joy of creativity. And one way to celebrate the creativity of its developers was to reward the man who left doodles around the office. Artist Rex Crowell was handed the opportunity to direct an entirely new project, and two unique selling points emerged. The first was that all its aesthetics were drawn from papercraft, while the second was how much the game was going to utilise the various functions of the PlayStation Vita. That game was Tearaway. It focuses on a little papercraft man named Iota, or a little papercraft lady named Atwa, who has to deliver a message to a very special person. You. This messenger set out on an adventure to reach the mysterious person who keeps peeping in on them through the sun, delivering a letter through the hole between their reality and ours. The game was a 3D platformer, one where players could use the Vita touchpads, both front and rear, to mess around with the world, while also creating papercraft projects to customize the world around them. Media Molecule even provided templates of various characters to encourage you to engage with papercraft in the real world. As a representative of the Vita's more unique features, it's not a huge surprise to see the messenger show up in Astro Bot. The papercraft postie title is easy to figure out, as this describes their world and their quest in one quick statement. In fact, all of their animations and descriptions relate to this goal, to deliver this message to you. Sadly, there isn't much more to this, which is a shame, because the messenger rolling into a ball, or the appearance of a squirrel, or maybe a finger poking through the ground would have all been neat references. Oh well. Tearaway was built for the Vita, and so is mostly relegated to that handheld. A PS4 version of the game was made shortly after, designed to make use of the DualShock 4 features, but beyond that, nothing more has really been done with Tearaway since. Astro Bot seems to have taken up the mantle of cute little guy showing off console features instead. The original Vita Tearaway is not available on PS5 for obvious reasons, but the PS4 remake, Unfolded, is. In 2010, students from DePaul University in Chicago released a free game that they'd been working on as a side project. Inspired by the wonky controls of Jurassic Park Trespasser, a game notorious for its absurd controls, producer John Murphy suggested the idea of playing a man controlling another man from inside like a wobbly mech. This idea developed into an octopus pretending to be a man, an Octodad, was born. After winning a Students' Showcase Award at the 2011 Independent Games Festival, 8 members of the team got together to form a new company with the goal of turning Octodad into a commercial product. After a successful Kickstarter campaign, the team, now called Young Horses, turned the game into Octodad Dadliest Catch. Sony heavily promoted the game as part of an exclusivity deal, and eventually the game would release on PS4 in 2014. You play as Octodad, an octopus pretending to be an ordinary suburban father. As Octodad, you must complete basic human tasks such as chores or caring for your children. Problem is, because you're an octopus, you lack a human skeleton. So controlling Octodad involved mostly flopping around with a complicated control scheme. All the while, you have to maintain the illusion of being a normal, innocent man and not cause too much chaos that makes folks suspicious of your true identity. I've been informed that Octodad is in Astro Bot, but all I see is this ordinary man. Wait a minute, he's called Secret Octopus? Damn it, he's good. His description says that nobody suspects a thing, which is a lyric in the game's main theme song. All his animations in the crash site are based around the floppy ragdoll physics of the original game, as Octodad desperately tries to stay standing up, and hitting him causes him to flop around awkwardly. Octodad experienced a brief period of exclusivity with Sony before it inevitably saw ports to other systems over time. However, Young Horses clearly had a good relationship with Sony, as they returned for the PS5 launch with another quirky game under an exclusivity deal, Bug Snacks, a game about catching creatures that are kinda bug and kinda snack. It's just as weird as you'd expect. After splitting with Microsoft in 2007 and completing Halo Reach as part of their remaining contract in 2010, Bungie were looking to produce something new. They partnered with Activision to produce a shooter set in a shared world, which would release in 2014 as Destiny for the PS4. Destiny is set in a sci-fi world where humanity is backed into one remaining city. After a mysterious entity named the Traveler granted humans the ability to travel to different planets, the solar system was colonized until an event known as the Collapse forced everyone back into the last city, where the Traveler now hangs comatose. However, some humans have been granted powers known as the Light, and with these powers they become guardians, protectors of humanity. Players take on the roles of these guardians, taking on story missions either solo or as a group. The game features an MMO-like structure, where raids and other activities are available in between major story arcs to keep people playing on a regular basis. Destiny was a hit on its release in 2014, although it was initially criticised for its lackluster content. This would change with additional expansions, however, as the story got stronger and its cast of characters became more fleshed out. A sequel would release in 2017, Bungie would split with Activision in 2019, and Sony would step in and purchase both Bungie and Destiny in 2022. This purchase is a big part of how Destiny got a representative bot in Astro Bot. This is the Exalted Exo, and it's not the player character. This is one of Destiny's more popular NPCs, Cade 6. Cade is an exo, which is a human consciousness uploaded to a robotic body. Cade is part of the Vanguard, an elite group of guardians who coordinate the operations to protect the city. Unlike his fellow Vanguard, Cade is a laid-back jokester who used to be an adventurer. His position as Vanguard is referenced in his bot description. His cocky attitude is a big part of his popularity, and is reflected in his main animation in the crash site, where he strikes various poses with his hand cannon, his weapon of choice. Similar poses to these can be seen a couple of times across the Destiny games. The description for the hand cannon also calls it exotic, which is a weapon rarity class in the original games that Cade's gun falls into. Finally, when you hit Cade, a chicken falls out of him. This is a reference to the Colonel, a chicken that Cade keeps as a pet. He has also used the Colonel to act as a distraction in battles. Destiny continues to be popular, although that popularity does wane with how much effort Bungie are willing to put in to keep the community happy, which fluctuates wildly. While they have been largely independent since Sony purchased them, ongoing management issues may result in Sony taking greater charge of the company as time goes on. That said, Destiny is still receiving updates, with the final Shape expansion releasing for Destiny 2 in 2024. Ready at Dawn have historically had a strong connection with Sony. Founded by developers from Naughty Dog and Blizzard, the studio started out making spin-off titles for various Sony projects. These included Daxter's solo game and 2 God of War PSP games. However, after several years of this, they decided it was time to produce something of their own. In 2015, they would release their first original project under Sony, The Order 1886. As the title implies, the game is set in 1886, or more specifically, an alternate history version of that year. Set in Victorian London, this cinematic third-person shooter sees you play as Sir Galahad, a member of the Order of Knights, founded from the original Knights of the Round Table. The Order has existed since King Arthur and operates with the goal of taking down beastly monsters that threaten the world. Galahad is a late addition to Astro Bot, marking the third knighted bot, and the only one that isn't a skeleton, sadly. His name is Rebellious Knight, a reference to how later parts of the game see him defy the Order due to complex political reasons. His description mentions half-breeds, the monstrous creatures found throughout the game. These half-man, half-beast creatures threaten humanity, and it's the Order's job to take them out wherever they appear. Galahad's gadget item is the Energy Zapper, which is a weapon that shoots arcs of electricity. This is the TS-21 Arc Induction Lance, one of several weapons developed by famous engineer Nikola Tesla to aid the Order in their fight against the half-breeds. Galahad gets to use this weapon a few times throughout the game, which proves effective against the beasts at full charge. The Order 1886 was a graphical powerhouse that showed off exactly what the PS4 was capable of. However, it received extensive criticism for its length and limited player agency. Thanks to this criticism, the game seemingly sold poorly, although this is merely speculation as Sony have never released official sales data, although that in itself isn't exactly a good sign. Following this, Ready at Dawn would move into the VR space, developing Lone Echo. They were acquired by Oculus in 2020, but then sadly closed down in 2024. In 2011, Swedish studio Arrowhead released their first game, Magicka, to huge critical acclaim, something that would lead them to pursuing a ton of projects immediately. One of these projects was made for Sony, a top-down co-op shooter named Helldivers, which released for PS4 in 2015. The game was set in a universe where humanity lives on Super Earth, governed by a single planetary government who rule with managed democracy. The Helldivers are an elite armed force who head out to bring diplomacy to those who might threaten Super Earth's way of life. And by diplomacy, I mean lots of firepower. It was a modest success, but definitely more of a niche cult classic than a game that took the world by storm. However, it did enjoy a decent amount of critical success, and for a time, that looked like the entire Helldivers story. In 2023, however, a sequel was revealed, and surprisingly, that game was now a third-person shooter. Helldivers 2 would release for PS5 in 2024. This time around, the game was a phenomenal success, going on to become one of Sony's biggest releases of 2024. So it's unsurprising that a squad of Helldivers snuck their way into Astro Bot with the Speedrun Levels DLC. This patriotic bunch are all named for their satirical roles in the Helldivers games. They are all named as if they are all diplomatic envoys and peacekeepers, but most of their journeys to other planets involve killing everything that moves. The propaganda that makes up much of the Helldivers lore is also present in 3 of the descriptions. The one exception to this is a description that mentions stratagems. Stratagems are codes that a Helldiver can input during their deployment for a variety of reasons. These include resupplies of ammo and health packs, orbital strikes, new weapons, and reinforcements. Speaking of reinforcements, 3 of the bots call in reinforcements if you hit them in the crash site. When hit, they will type in the reinforce stratagem, and a pod will fall from the sky and cause a new Helldiver to spawn out of it. This pod is how players enter a mission, either at the start or as reinforcement, and they crash directly into the ground, allowing the Helldiver within to emerge out of the ground. These pods can also be steered towards targets to cause damage. The one in Astro Bot takes out the original Helldiver and replaces them with a new one, much like how Reinforce works within Helldivers 2. When not calling for reinforcements, these Helldivers will stand in the Super Earth salute, as seen in a variety of places within the Helldivers games. The 4th Helldiver is special, however, as they are attempting to put up a flag. This is a reference to the Spread Democracy mission objective, where players must raise a flag to Super Earth somewhere on the planet that they spawn on. This flag must then be defended for a set amount of time before democracy spreads and the mission is successful. When hit, a bunch of spiders will come out of the ground while they're distracted, causing them to panic and brush them away with the flag. This is a reference to the Terminids, a common enemy type in Helldivers, which are terrible bug monsters. As stated, the original Helldivers was a modest success, but the sequel has been a phenomenon. While recent months have seen player counts slow down a little, the game is still incredibly active and shows no signs of stopping. After Demon's Souls and the success of the Dark Souls games that followed, From Software became industry darlings. Their games featured a specific formula, but one that captured the imaginations of many. So it was only a matter of time before the original publisher of Demon's Souls would come back and ask for another. However, instead of a Demon's Souls sequel, From Software would work with Sony to produce a game with the same formula, set in a moody, Lovecraftian version of Victorian London. That game was Bloodborne. Bloodborne is set in Yharnam, a moody Gothic town plagued by horrible monsters. You are a hunter, someone seeking to take down these beasts and find the source of the plague that's creating them. Of course, this isn't an easy task because, well, this is a FromSoft game, so expect to die a lot. It played similarly to Demon's Souls, albeit with a faster combat system that emphasized quick dodging over shields and gave the player a gun for additional limited long-range options. Unlike Demon's Souls, which took a few years before people really appreciated it, the success of Dark Souls meant that Bloodborne was incredibly well received on launch. It's generally considered to be one of the best games not only of 2015 or the PS4, but of all time. Unsurprisingly then, the hunter appears in Astro Bot. They're known as the Yharnam Tourist, which is a reference to the main location of Bloodborne and the fact that their presence in the town is as a newcomer. Their gacha item is the Hunting Essentials, which are the Saw Cleaver and the Hunting Pistol, two of the game's early options for weapons. The Hunter Bot can be seen wielding the Saw Cleaver, including making use of its ability to transform it and extend its range. If you try and hit them, they will instantly parry you with the pistol, which is a direct reference to a parry move available to you in Bloodborne. As for the Yharnam Tourist description, that's a bit of a spoiler. Skip ahead to this timestamp if you don't want to know. As the game progresses, it's revealed that Yharnam is in thrall to the Great Old Ones, monstrous godlike beings of grand cosmic power, clearly inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Bloodborne has 3 endings depending on your actions in the game, and 2 of these result in the hunter allying with the Great Old Ones, whether it's allowing one of them to embrace them or being reincarnated as a Great Old One themselves. This is almost certainly where the destined for greatness description comes from, especially with the capitalization on great. So yeah, it's a bit of a dark one, but it's Bloodborne, so what do you expect? Bloodborne got a DLC expansion a few months after release, where players were encouraged to explore the Hunter's Nightmare, a new area that acts as a prison for past hunters. One of these hunters is Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, who can be found in, well, the Astral Clock Tower. She's found, seemingly dead, on a throne, but approaching her initiates a boss fight against her. She's a notable character due to her presence on official artwork for the DLC, her role as a protector of the Nightmare's biggest secret, and her apparent similarity to the Plain Doll, Bloodborne's equivalent of the Maiden in Black, who offers you stat upgrades in exchange for souls. Oh, sorry, in this game they're blood echoes. They function exactly like souls though. Unsurprisingly then, she's also in Astro Bot, imported over from Astro's Playroom as one of the late edition special bots. She is referred to as the Nightmare Guardian, a reference to her role as the Nightmare's center. She is found sitting on a throne, just like how she's found in the Bloodborne DLC, and hitting her causes her to look around, possibly a reference to her vigilance even in death. Her unlock method in Astro's Playroom is heavily tied to the idea of time, as you have to input the DLC's release date to unlock her, which is almost certainly a nod to her being found in a clock tower. Bloodborne remains one of Sony's most beloved games, and one of the few that players desperately would love to see a PC port or sequel of. Tons of merchandise and additional material have been released based on Bloodborne, and it's clear that enthusiasm is still high, even if Sony seemingly don't want to follow up on that. From Software have continued to produce beloved games ever since, with the likes of Sekiro and Elden Ring winning awards and sales across the board. After the release of Shadow of the Colossus, Fumito Ueda was surprised to learn that players built a strong bond with aggro, and realised there was a game idea in that. His next project was built around the idea of developing a bond with a creature, one inspired by animals he grew up with, all kind of smushed together into a single beast. However, while development began in 2007, it quickly hit problems. Despite being ready 2 years later, it became obvious that the game didn't run well on the PS3 it was targeting. Sony, trusting in Ueda's vision, sent additional development help to try and get the game running, but it quickly became clear it wasn't going to work. Instead, once the PS4 entered development, the game was transferred over, eventually seeing a full release in 2016. The Last Guardian was similar to Team Ico's previous games, only now you're playing an unnamed boy who wakes up to find himself in a ruined castle next to a strange beast, chained up and wounded. After healing and feeding the creature, the boy manages to bond with it, and the two begin to explore their strange surroundings together. The game mostly focuses on this bond, with puzzles requiring both the boy and the creature named Trico to complete. Being the third and final Team Ico project, and due to how heavily anticipated it was ahead of its release, it's no surprise that The Last Guardian got just as much representation in Astro Bot as its predecessors. The boy is the beast tamer, while Trico is the barrel muncher. Barrel muncher refers to how you feed Trico in The Last Guardian by finding glowing barrels and taking them to it, which it will gleefully devour. The boy's description mentions that he will one day have an incredible story to tell, a reference to how The Last Guardian is told through a narrator, which is shown to be the boy at a much older age. This also connects to his gacha item, the treasured memento, referred to as a souvenir. This is one of Trico's feathers, and likely the only thing the boy has left of the beast in his later life. Trico's description says that it sometimes does what it's told, a reference to a common complaint people had about The Last Guardian. Trico was programmed to be an animal and, as such, acts like one. This does mean that sometimes it just doesn't listen to your commands and acts on its own instincts. It's a remarkable technical achievement and a nice attention to detail, but sometimes it was mechanically frustrating. Its gacha item is the Restraint Remnants, a reference to the chains that Trico is found in at the start of the game. The bond between the two characters is referenced in their animations. When standing normally, the boy can be seen calling out for Trico in distress, seemingly unable to look behind him. This calling is a reference to the in-game mechanic where you can press a button to call Trico over to you. Meanwhile, hitting the boy causes Trico to roar at you defensively, and it's notable that it doesn't do this when you attack it directly. The Last Guardian was highly anticipated, but ultimately the least well received of all of Team Ico's projects. Frustrations at controlling Trico and a feeling that the game would have been better off launching in 2009 were both major factors. The game just didn't quite grab players in the same way the developer's previous games did. That said, there are definitely fans of the game who feel it completes a worthy trilogy. Sadly, we are unlikely to see more of this universe thanks to Japan Studios' closure and Ueda's departure to his own company, Gen Design. That company have been busy though, as they have recently revealed a game with a giant robot, and we know nothing else about it. Koei began development on a game based on an unfinished Akira Kurosawa script in 2004. Originally meant to be a JRPG, the project just kept hitting walls. After 4 years, Koei merged with Tecmo and the project was just scrapped. Development would later shift to Omega Force, who retooled the game as a Dynasty Warriors style game, because of course they did. This too was also scrapped, and Tecmo studio Team Ninja took on the project in 2010, and they retooled it, unsurprisingly, as a Ninja Gaiden style game, until 2014, when the project was reset yet again into a completely new genre. This time, the project stuck, and Nioh released in 2017 for the PS4. Nioh focused on the story of William Adams, the first known British person to set foot in Japan. Unlike the real Adams, this version of him was inexplicably Irish and headed to Japan in pursuit of an occultist who stole a spirit instead of stumbling onto it during a disastrous trade mission like he did in real life. Once in Japan, William sees the country overrun by yokai and agrees to join the fight. This also did not happen in real life. The game itself was similar in style to a Souls-like, but with a Team Ninja style flair. The gameplay was a little faster and looser than From Software's works, and there was a mechanic known as Ki, which allowed you to perform more powerful actions with the right timing. William Adams is in Astro Bot as the Western Warrior, a reference to how he's based on the first and possibly only English samurai. His description mentions him being a pirate, which is his official job for Queen Elizabeth, a role that the real Adams did not fill. William appears to be wearing the Youngblood armour, the set he wears on the game's cover art and other promotional material. His gacha item is the Foreigner's Katana. This is seemingly supposed to be one of the sword types used by William within Nioh, and the description references much of Nioh's gameplay. However, once this sword is obtained, it doesn't behave as William's weapon. Instead, it shows up as a sword embedded in the ground, surrounded by an ominous red aura. William will stand fearfully of it, trying to ignore its tempting allure. Hitting him will cause him to grab the sword by accident and make him hastily replace it. This is a reference to the Revenants of Nioh. These were spirits that could be summoned by the player from swords in the ground similar to the one in Astro Bot. These could either be placed there by a developer, or were based on the build of another player who died in the area. These were often tough fights that could grant the player rare gear when defeated. This explains William's expressions in Astro Bot, as he's scared of the challenge, but tempted by the rewards. In addition, this sword can be seen in the logo for Nioh itself. Nioh was a huge success despite its long development. It's often held up as one of the best Souls-likes to come from a company that isn't FromSoft, and even managed to get a sequel in 2020. After the Killzone series, Guerrilla were interested in pursuing other projects. After putting together 40 proposals for new games, they went for the one that initially seemed to be the riskiest. This idea would prove to be a technical challenge, combining massive open-world exploration with complex fights against robot dinosaurs. After tackling these challenges head-on, the project would eventually come together as a PS4 game in 2017, Horizon Zero Dawn. The game was set in a world where robotic animals roamed the landscape and humanity had seemingly regressed to tribal societies. You played as Aloy, a young woman who had been cast out of her tribe due to her unusual birth. She was raised in the wilderness, where she learnt to hunt and fend for herself. As she muscles her way into a coming-of-age ceremony, attacks from an aggressive tribe wielding terrifying new weapons wreak havoc. In response, Aloy sets out across the world to track these invaders down and uncover secrets about the nature of everything around her. The game was an open-world exploration game, where the vast wilds of former America were explorable by the player. Aloy was a hunter, and her abilities reflected this, with a proficiency in ranged weaponry and traps at her disposal. Your opponents were typically robots that resembled real-world animals, who were formidable foes because, well, they're robots. Aloy appears in Astro Bot as you defeat the 5th and final galaxy boss. She appears as she does in promotional material for the game's sequel, Horizon Forbidden West, wearing clothing associated with the Utaro tribe, who live in a giant tree that sprouted around some satellite dishes. The outfit in question is the Utaro Harvester, without the associated hat. Aloy is the Machine Hunter and is frequently depicted brandishing her bow. This is a reference to some of the principal combat of the Horizon series, where Aloy will use ranged weapons to attack the machines that roam the lands. Her gacha item is a bunny, one of the few non-mechanical animals that can be found in the game, and can be optionally hunted, if you're a monster. They don't have any major significance though, so I'm not sure why they're so fixated on them in Astro Bot. However, unlocking Aloy also takes you to a level built heavily around the Horizon franchise. And so, for the final time, we're going to go through this level piece by piece, uncovering every reference that it has for us. The level opens with Astro gliding his way through the ruins of the Golden Gate Bridge. This is firmly a reference to the second game, Horizon Forbidden West. As the name suggests, the game is set in the remnants of the US West Coast, where the ruins of the bridge can naturally be found. Forbidden West also introduced flying mounts, allowing you to get a similar experience to this opening. Once Astro has received Aloy's bow and taken on her appearance, you can create a couple of bridges for yourself to reach your first bot based on another character, the Loyal Oseram. First of all, an explanation of what an Oseram is. It is one of the tribes in Horizon. There are several tribes in the game, with Aloy being from the Nora tribe, a matriarchal society who value nature. The Oseram are tinkerers and labourers, denoted by clothing that resembles blacksmith aprons. Erend is a member of this tribe, introduced in Zero Dawn during a diplomatic mission from the Kaja, a sun-worshipping tribe with a tense history with the Nora. Erend helps calm down a mob, and soon introduces himself to Aloy. He quickly becomes an ally to Aloy across both Horizon games. He's a jovial, helpful guy who knows his way around a hammer. He's also fond of drinking, which we see plenty of times in the original games, which is why he's found in Astro Bot sitting on barrels having the time of his life. After finding Erend, we have to cross a gap using some platforms. This allows us to reach a tribal gate. Specifically, this is a design belonging to the Knack, a tribe introduced in Forbidden West. They are a tribe built around conflict, inspired by a museum dedicated to US soldiers that they built their lands around. This fits in with how much of the level is based on environments from Forbidden West, as most of the western portion of that game's map is Knack territory. Once through the gate, we reach an area with red grass circling a pond, where we can hide from the missile-firing enemies. This is a gameplay mechanic lifted directly from the original games, where Aloy's red hair makes her harder to spot in thick grass with red sprouts, allowing her to use it for stealth. The red grass also appears next to Aloy in the crash site. Near this grass is the remains of an office, with a pile of broken old computer equipment in the middle, and holograms of office workers surrounding it. This is a reference to the various ruins that Aloy can explore throughout the series. These are long abandoned facilities where the computer equipment is falling apart, and the holograms are a form of tech the old ones had developed. In the office you can find the Security Scouter bot, the first of two machine-based bots. So let's dig into the machines of Horizon, the selling point of the entire game. The Security Scouter is based on the Watcher, a scout droid that was a common sight in Horizon Zero Dawn. They would usually be found hanging around other packs of machines, acting as guards and scouts for them. They're based on theropod dinosaurs and feature a camera for a head, indicating their status as observers and guards, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. Later in the level you can find the Grass Guzzler bot, which is based on the Grazer. These machines are based on deer and will travel around cutting grass and repurposing it into fuel, making them an essential part of the world's robotic ecosystem. They can often be hunted for this fuel and other parts. Their fuel canisters can also be found in the level itself in various places as an obvious green target that can be shot. This is a reference to how canisters could be detonated in Horizon using fire arrows, although doing this would destroy them as materials to harvest. The canisters could also be ripped off grazers where necessary. While these are the only bots based on machines, other machine references do appear in the level itself. For instance, this snake-like enemy shows up a few times, usually dispatched by shooting a canister attached to it. This enemy is likely a reference to the Slitherfang, a machine introduced in Forbidden West. These snake-like enemies could fire acid, in absence of poison in Horizon, and were often tough fights. You can also occasionally encounter crocodile-like machines in the level. These are likely based on the Snapmaw, which first appeared in Horizon Zero Dawn. This croc helps with water purification, although in Astro Bot they act as snapping platforms, which is a bit of a downgrade. There are a couple more machines that are referenced, but we'll get to them a bit later. For now, let's move on with the level to an area littered with electrified tripwires. This is a reference to the Tripcaster weapon that Aloy can acquire in both games. As you may have guessed, the Tripcaster creates tripwires, as two bolts get fired into the ground based on where you aim the weapon, and a wire will automatically cross the two. These tripwires can be electrified, allowing you to set traps along machine patrol paths, making it easier to tackle them head on. In Astro Bot, they're just a hazard, although it is possible to lead enemies towards them, and there's even a trophy for doing so. Shortly after this, you can encounter a cave that you have to swim through. This is a reference to Forbidden West, which introduced the ability to swim underwater. During a mission set in the ruins of Las Vegas, you needed to enter a flooded dome. In order to survive the swim, Aloy had to construct a diving mask, allowing her to breathe underwater. This diving mask could then be used elsewhere in the world to navigate sunken caverns, which contained valuable materials, including green shine, a valuable crystal that can also be seen in the cave in Astro Bot. As you leave the cave, you can also find another bot, the Paternal Outcast. This is Rost, Aloy's father figure. Much like Aloy, he was also cast out of the Nora tribe and lived on the edge of the territory where he raised her from birth. This explains his name, and his description references the fact that he trained Aloy in everything she knows. His gadget item is the Ancient Interface, which is based on the Focus device found in Horizon Zero Dawn. This is a bit of wearable tech used by the Old Ones civilization, which was used for communication, viewing media, scanning the world, generating holograms, and so on. It was basically a fancy AR smartphone worn on the temple. Aloy acquires one of these as a child and wears it throughout the entire series. It's basically an in-universe excuse to create a sci-fi HUD for players, allowing them to scan machines for weaknesses, among other things. However, while Aloy embraced the focus she found, Rost was less keen on it. The Nora as a tribe feared the technology of the Old Ones and forbade anyone exploring the ruins and making use of what they found within. While an outcast, Rost still viewed this tech as taboo and was concerned about Aloy using it. This is why his bot version shows absolute terror around it sitting on the floor near him. After leaving the cave, you'll encounter this big stompy boy. This is a special machine known as a Tall Neck, and is found frequently throughout the Horizon games. These giraffe-like machines wander the landscape without a care for anything that may be in their way, scanning the area constantly. They are effectively a long-range communications array for the machines, allowing them to coordinate their roles. Aloy can also climb onto their satellite-like head and hack into them to gain map data. In other words, they're mobile radio towers. Speaking of towers, the Tall Neck in the level is patrolling around a large satellite tower. There are many structures like this in Horizon, the ruins of the old civilization, but I think I can pinpoint exactly which of these ruins this is based on. The first Tall Neck you encounter in Horizon Forbidden West is patrolling a very similar tower, so I feel this may be the inspiration. In the original game, you use the satellite dish to get onto the Tall Neck, while in Astro Bot, you use the Tall Neck to get on top of the satellite dish to proceed. After climbing the tower, Astroy can enter a large metallic cave. This is a cauldron which are found across the world and contain factories that manufacture machines. Few people have entered these facilities, which operate autonomously at all times. Cauldrons often showed up in quests, as Aloy could obtain machine data from their central systems, although she'd usually have to fight a few hostile machines in the process. Within the cauldron, you can find the cherished Wanderer bot. This is Silence, a character originally played by the beloved late actor Lance Reddick, famed for playing mysterious characters with inscrutable motivations. So it's not really surprising that Silence is a mysterious character with inscrutable motivations. Aloy meets him a few times in her journey in Zero Dawn, and in order to fully explain Silence and his gadget item, as well as a few additional concepts I've skipped over in the process, I will need to now discuss massive spoilers for the Horizon games. Skip ahead to this timestamp if you do not want to know any further. Silence is a wanderer from an unknown tribe, although widely theorized to be from the cold-dwelling Banuk. He is fascinated by the old world and wishes to learn more about it. This is referenced in the bot's description. By the time Aloy meets him, he knows a considerable amount about the world, and this is because of Hades. And oh boy, buckle up, because Hades requires some explanation. Centuries before Horizon Zero Dawn, a highly advanced Earth walked into a crisis of its own making. A man named Ted Faro developed military robots with artificial intelligence, the ability to use biofuel for power, and were self-replicating. However, he neglected to add a backdoor override to these robots, fearing attacks from foreign spies, and when the robots started self-replicating to an exponential degree and feeding on every bit of biological life on the planet, it became clear that Faro kicked off a massive extinction event. While it was hopeless to stop any of this, a new plan was enacted that would allow the Earth to reset itself, to bring about a Zero Dawn, if you will. Using the remnants of biological material, the last scientists created a seed and DNA bank and developed a powerful AI system that would know when and how to restart life on the planet. This AI system is governed by a parent AI known as Gaia, with a series of subordinate functions, all named for Greek gods. To terraform the planet, a function known as Hephaestus built the machines that would seed the planet, guided by Poseidon, Demeter, and Aether, to detoxify the Earth and bring plant life back, while Artemis and Eleuthia would bring back animal life and humans respectively. There were other functions, but this is just a summary of how it all worked. In the event of a failed terraforming project, a function known as Hades was created that could issue a kill command that reverses the terraforming, and Hades is the one we need to know the most about. You might notice that Silence has an orb of some kind. This orb contains Hades, the kill switch subordinate function I just described, and he is very keen on keeping this close to himself, as Hades has taught him all that he knows about the world. What he doesn't initially know is that Hades intends to use him to kill all organic life on the planet. After figuring this out, Silence recruits Aloy to help trap Hades in an orb, which he then tortures for information in Forbidden West. This connection to Hades is why his bot version is so fixated on an orb. Also, since we're talking spoilers, would be a good time to explain Aloy's description, which I have entirely skipped over at this point. Silence is interested in Aloy because Hades is targeting her, and this is because she bears a striking resemblance to the lead researcher on the Zero Dawn project, Elizabeth Sobeck. This is because Aloy is a clone of Sobeck, deliberately birthed by the facility in Nora territory as a way to bring back her brilliant mind to the world in the event of a crisis. This explains Aloy's motherless birth that leads to her to become an outcast, and it also explains her bot description, which says there may be others like her. And note that that is plural, because a second clone of Sobeck, Beta, is introduced in Forbidden West, as part of a group who fled Earth and are now returning. She becomes part of Aloy's crew during the game's story. That was a lot, but we are almost done with Horizon. After the cauldron, Asteroid can emerge into a shoreline with deep red waters. While there are no red seas in Horizon, there is a mission in Forbidden West where a river has turned red due to the presence of red algae, and a dam preventing clean water from flushing through. It could also be a reference to the Burning Shores DLC, which saw a California sitting on a magma lake, although the seas themselves were rarely deep red. In this area, you can fight a massive T-Rex, which is a reference to one of Horizon Zero Dawn's more formidable machines, the Thunderjaw. This hulking great T-Rex monstrosity can be found stomping around in various places, and as you can probably imagine, is not very easy to fight. The boss fight in Astro Bot, which is called the Blunderjaw, is similar to how you fight a Thunderjaw by getting it to reveal weak points along its sides, although the actual Thunderjaw is a lot more fearsome than this goofy boy. It's also one of Horizon's more recognisable machines, as it appeared in the game's initial reveal trailer, and it shows up on the cover of the game itself. And of course, there is the music, which is based heavily off Aloy's theme, the main theme to Horizon Zero Dawn. This theme appeared in a variety of arrangements throughout the game, reflective of both the grand adventure and pensive solitude of Aloy's quest. The name of the track, The Strength to Stand Alone, is a direct quote from Rost prior to Aloy entering the Proving, that coming-of-age ceremony I mentioned.
The strength to stand alone, Aloy, is the strength to make a stand.
But that's not all, because the music that plays during the fight against the Blunderjaw appears to be a remix of a track from Forbidden West called A Wager Over Barrels. This is a jaunty tune that plays inside the tavern in Chainscrape, an Oseram outpost found early in the game. Not only was this track remixed as the boss fight, but elements of it were also used in the main remixes of the level. It is a sneaky inclusion, but it's definitely there. And that is all for Horizon, the final franchise represented with a full level in Astro Bot. The Horizon series is a huge hit for Sony, vastly outselling Guerrilla's previous project, and plans are afoot for many more games in the series to come. A third game is said to be in development, along with a possible Monster Hunter-style co-op game. A LEGO-based spin-off also recently released. Guerrilla are committed to the series, especially while both main games have sold a ton of copies and made it one of Sony's best-selling franchises. In 2013, veteran game developers from across the industry got together to form the VR-focused studio Impulse Gear. They would soon sign a deal to make a game for the upcoming PlayStation VR headset, making full use of the new technology. That game would be a first-person shooter named Farpoint. During a routine mission conducted by scientists around Jupiter, An energy source the team are investigating becomes a wormhole. This pulls in 3 scientists, Dr. Grant Moon, Dr. Ava Tyson, and an unseen, unnamed third person that you play. The 3 of them find themselves on a far-off planet, trapped and surrounded by dangerous creatures. The game was a first-person shooter in VR, where players wandered this alien landscape, taking out the threats that came their way. Remember the aim controller I mentioned in the Killzone section? It was developed for this game as it allowed players to freely aim in VR. As a heavily representative game for PlayStation VR, Farpoint is represented in Astro Bot as the wormhole survivor, a reference to the setup of the game. It appears as a bot wearing a spacesuit with a VR helmet aiming around with the aim controller. This is mainly due to how we never saw the player character, but we know he wears a spacesuit similar to his colleagues. The helmet and gun are obvious nods to the game's VR nature. The description of the bot mentions they're 3 billion years from home, a reference to a reveal that they're 8,000 light years from Earth. Using maths and an average modern spacecraft speed, 8,000 light years would roughly take 3 billion years to travel, so it all checks out. The gun's description mentions hostile threats, and hitting the bot reveals some spider-like creatures popping out of the ground. This is a reference to a common enemy in Farpoint, a jumping spider that liked to burrow through the ground towards you. Farpoint was generally praised as a fun and innovative VR experience, and sold well as far as VR games go. After Farpoint, Impulse Gear would go on to make Larcenauts for Steam VR and Oculus, expanding on the FPS mechanics in a purely multiplayer environment. While Farpoint is playable on PS5, it will require the original PlayStation VR headset to play. In 2015, former employees of Bungie and Rockstar got together to form a new company, one that specialises in VR games. After receiving funding from a capital firm founded by former IDOS boss Ian Livingston, the company, now called Polyarch, got to work on their first game, a puzzle platformer named Moss. This is a VR game where the player takes the role of a reader, someone who is able to see into the world that exists within a storybook. The story is about a little mouse adventurer named Quill, who sets out on a journey to rescue her homeland from the clutches of an evil snake named Sarfog. Moss was unusual in that the player filled 2 roles. You controlled Quill directly, like you would in any other puzzle platformer, but you also played the reader, who was capable of magically manipulating the scenery around Quill. She could communicate with you using American Sign Language for hints and suggestions. The game's original release was as a temporary exclusive for PlayStation VR, so as such, Quill makes an appearance in Astro Bot as the intrepid rodent. Her description is a reference to how the game takes place within a storybook, and how in certain portions of the story, you have to actively turn pages to advance it. The storybook is also one of her gacha items, which she can be seen reading in the crash site, her expression changing with each page as she reacts to the story. Her other item is the Jade Blade, a reference to a weapon that Quill obtains within the second chapter of Moss. This is given to her by mystical beings known as sprites, and the blade is made from a mythical material known as glass. It's the sword of the former champion who saved the world in a past story. Quill then uses this as her primary weapon throughout the story. Moss is perhaps one of the more well-known VR games out there, and managed to snag a bunch of Best VR Game awards from across the board. It even managed to get a sequel, Moss Book 2, which released in 2022. Unlike Farpoint, while Moss was released for the original PlayStation VR, a version playable for VR2 is also available, making it 100% playable on PS5. In 2012, prior to the release of Beyond Two Souls, Quantic Dream released a tech demo named Kara, which mainly existed to show improvements in motion capture technology. It featured a realistic android being built and exhibiting human-like behaviour, leading to her being threatened with disassembly and begging to live. It wasn't intended to be turned into a game, but after the completion of Beyond, director David Cage realised he wanted to see what happened next. Production on a game about androids was quickly put into motion, with the setting of Detroit chosen due to the city's economic decline and how the introduction of android workers would accelerate that. The game was to follow Quantic Dream's formula from their previous games, and actor Jesse Williams was hired as the face of the game. Eventually, after 4 years of development, Detroit Become Human released for the PS4 in 2018. It focused on 3 androids in a future Detroit. Kara returned as a housekeeper android who develops consciousness and works to protect a young girl from an abusive father. Jesse Williams played Marcus, a caretaker who becomes an activist after gaining consciousness. And finally, there was Connor, a police android whose job was hunting down other androids who've deviated from programmed behaviours, only to discover he begins to display those anomalies himself. Connor shows up in Astro Bot as the Deviant Hunter. This refers to his job and the term used for defective androids who've gained consciousness, deviants. His description is the droid that droids dread due to how ruthless androids of his model can be in taking down the ones with emotions. Once his gacha item is obtained, he can be seen in the crash site where he exhibits behaviours between his programming and true consciousness. Normally, he'll stand there throwing a coin around with extreme precision. This was an action he would perform in the original game as a tell towards his mechanical nature. However, hitting him or the fish tank that accompanies him causes the fish to fall out. This causes him to panic and gently put the fish back, kissing the tank affectionately as he does. This references a choice early on in the game. In fact, it's the very first choice in the game, where Connor can find a fish on the ground and choose to leave it, or save its life by putting it back in the water. Choosing the latter causes a software instability as he begins to develop emotions such as empathy for the fish, and put him on the path to his own deviancy. Detroit Become Human was Quantic Dream's last project with Sony as they moved into publishing both their own games and indie projects that need additional support. They were recently confirmed to be working on a Star Wars project called Eclipse. Insomniac's history after the release of the first Ratchet & Clank is complicated. The studio spent the PS2 era pumping out games in the series, but for the PS3 they decided to try something new. Resistance: Fall of Man released as a launch title for the PS3 and received 2 sequels alongside the Ratchet & Clank future games. But as you can probably tell by how late this entry is and how it didn't open with the PS3 startup screen, Resistance is not represented in Astro Bot in any way. After the Resistance trilogy though, Insomniac wanted to stretch their wings. They'd produced games almost entirely for Sony and wanted to branch out a little. They would work with a range of publishers during the 2010s, including EA on Fuse, GameStop of all companies on Song of the Deep, and Microsoft on Sunset Overdrive. However, none of these games really lived up to expectations, and the studio would soon return to Sony for a Ratchet & Clank reboot and another project that Sony were offering them. But before we get to that, we've got to go back a lot further than any other entry in this video. Dateline, 1939. Martin Goodman founds the comic book company Timely Publications and launches their first periodical, Marvel Comics #1. The advent of World War II also led to the patriotic comic Captain America Comics #1. These comics were hugely successful, a great American success story. Okay, that's enough of that. In the 1950s, Timely would undergo some changes, becoming Magazine Management, Atlas Comics, and extremely briefly, Goodman Comics. This was until the company eventually realised its best branding was in its original comic book, and they changed their name to Marvel Comics in 1961. It was around this time that their lead editor, Stanley Lieber, known professionally as Stan Lee, began to push for a new direction in superhero comics. In 1962, he noticed a rise in interest among teens for comic books, and he wanted a hero who could represent that market. Inspired by the pulp stories of crime fighter The Spider, he settled on a superhero called Spider-Man. The character would then make his debut in Amazing Fantasy number 15 as the cover star before becoming the lead of his own series, The Amazing Spider-Man, in 1963. I probably don't need to explain who Spider-Man is, but I'm going to do it anyway, for the sake of it. Spider-Man is the superhero identity of Peter Parker, an ordinary high school student who gets bitten by a radioactive spider and gains abilities comparable to the arachnid species. These powers include web slinging, the ability to climb on walls, superhuman strength, the ability to scuttle under the fridge when you turn the light on in a dark room. Wait, sorry, no, let me correct that. The ability to sense danger. That's it. Spider-Man quickly became one of Marvel's most successful characters, possibly even the most successful superhero character of all time. Spider-Man comics continue to be published to this day. Cartoons and movie adaptations have been produced in abundance for decades, and naturally, he's also shown up in video games. I'm not going into the entire history of Spider-Man in video games, but I will confess that the placement of this doesn't quite reflect Spider-Man's actual PlayStation debut, and honestly, that's because I'm not sure I know exactly when it is. Some of you may be going, yes, well, it has to be Spider-Man, developed by Tony Hawk developer Neversoft and published by Activision in the year 2000. That was his first PlayStation game, right? But no, because Marvel vs. Capcom released on the PS1 in 1999, and there he is, beating up Capcom characters a full year before his own game. Was he in any other games before then in a similar capacity? I have no idea. So this is complicated. Or is it? Because it turns out there are multiple iterations of Spider-Man, many Spiders-Men, if you will, and each iteration exists within its own universe as part of the wider Marvel multiverse. So today, we are specifically talking about the debut of the wholly original character, Spider-Man of Earth 1048. Which brings us back to Insomniac. The offer that Sony gave them? It was a Spider-Man game. And while Insomniac's head Ted Price was initially reluctant, the team were incredibly excited. And so, they would go on to release Spider-Man in 2018 exclusively for the PS4. The game was an open-world game where web-swinging your way through New York was the order of the day. Spidey's quest was taking down Mr. Negative before he can seize control of the criminal underworld and release a deadly virus. And no, I'm not going to go into who Mr. Negative is, this entry's long enough as it is. Because Spider-Man 2018 is a first-party title, developed by one of Sony's most closely associated studios, this specific version of Spider-Man appears in Astro Bot. He is the neighborhood hero, a reference to his phrase that he's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. This phrase first debuted in The Amazing Spider-Man number 17, itself a reference to an old-timey advertising slogan. This also pops up in his description, and the amazing part, as you've probably guessed, is based on the original comic series being called The Amazing Spider-Man. Both terms do appear within Insomniac's Spider-Man games. His gadget item is a set of web shooters. This is how Spider-Man is able to shoot web lines everywhere, as this device produces the webs and fires them. This is how 1048 Spider-Man does this, as opposed to other variants who can do it organically. I'm looking at you, Tobey Maguire. This allows him to swing around New York, his primary means of getting around. This means Spider-Man spends a lot of time in high places, which is why he can be found on top of the PS5 in the crash site. Whacking him will cause him to pull himself back with his webs. When Astro isn't knocking him off the highest point, he can be found staring down on the world, occasionally removing his mask to reveal his true identity, Peter Parker, and this appearance is based on the Peter Parker seen in Insomniac's game. But wait, was this a second Spider-Man? In 2011, a reimagining of Spider-Man arrived, with the goal of taking over the role for a modern audience in the Ultimate Marvel line of comics. Inspired by the election of US President Barack Obama, this version of Spider-Man was going to be black, representative of a significant part of New York's cultural background, and inspired heavily by Donald Glover. Miles Morales debuted in Ultimate Comics Fallout No. 4 as a Spider-Man from Earth 1610 who emerged from experiments to recreate the original Peter Parker Spider-Man after his death in that universe. Miles proved to be a popular character with many, leading to his version of Spider-Man becoming a secondary version of the character in pop culture. With this newfound popularity, Miles started making appearances in movies, and most importantly for us, Insomniac's Spider-Man universe. Miles appears throughout the 2018 game. However, he is not yet a Spider-Man. Instead, he is just a teenager who admires Peter Parker's Spider-Man and even learns some self-defense from him. At the end of the game, he is bitten by a genetically altered spider, similar to his comics origin, although Peter Parker does not die in this particular origin. Miles would then get a short side game in 2020, before teaming up with Peter full-time in 2023's Spider-Man 2. He is also in Astro Bot as the youthful protector, a reference to his younger age and him being Peter's protege. His description reveals his original identity. His gacha item is the pet carrier, which comes complete with a cat. This is Spider Cat, a cat that Miles can rescue in his titular game, who then goes on to become his sidekick as Spider Cat, who can even help in fights, which is adorable. When hit, Spider Cat will be knocked off the PS5, and Miles will use additional powers to chase after him before webbing back. Miles has the ability to channel bioelectricity, as introduced in his eponymous game, obtained during a fight with Rhino while protecting Peter. These powers become a major part of his arsenal throughout the games. I probably don't need to discuss the legacy of Spider-Man, I've been over a lot of it already. He's going to keep appearing in places, and his most recent video game appearance is Marvel Rivals, released in December 2024. As for Insomniac Spider-Man specifically, it's unknown if we'll see any more of him. The studio is currently working on a Wolverine game, but it's likely that they could return to Spider-Man someday. Speaking of Insomniac overall, despite resisting Sony for years on offers to outright buy the studio, the success of Spider-Man was ultimately the thing that led Insomniac to agree to a buyout by Sony, making them now officially one of PlayStation's first-party studios. After releasing a series of puzzle games for PCs in the early 90s, Blank Berlin & Co. changed their name to Eidetic and developed their first console game. What could possibly go wrong? Well, that game could become Bubsy 3D, one of the most notoriously terrible video games ever made. Oh, that's unfortunate. So, clearly not every developer has the best start, but fortunately, Eidetic were able to turn things around very quickly when John Garvin of Sony's 989 Studios approached them with a request to make a spy game. That game would become Siphon Filter, a PS1 spy game that won vast amounts of critical and commercial acclaim and fixed the studio's reputation. Siphon Filter is not represented in Astro Bot, so we will move on to what happened after the release of Siphon Filter. Sony would acquire the studio in 2000, renaming them to Bend Studio. They would develop more Siphon Filter games up until Logan Shadow in 2007. After this, they developed spin-off games for Insomniac and Naughty Dog before turning their attention to a new project. Garvin and the team decided on an open-world game set in their home state of Oregon, with inspiration from Sons of Anarchy and The Walking Dead. That game would become Days Gone. You play as Deacon St. John, a biker living in a post-apocalyptic world. A virus has infected humanity, causing people to become violent, zombie-like creatures that Deacon and his friends have nicknamed Freakers. He now has to survive in this new world, living out in the wilderness with his friend Boomer, dealing with the infected and the real monster, which I must remind you, is man. Deke shows up in Astro Bot as the brave biker, as his membership of the Mongols biker gang is a central aspect of the game. In fact, much of the bot's presence centers on this. His gacha item is his drifter bike, which gets dismantled for parts early on and is steadily rebuilt and customized over the course of the game. The bike is important as the Freakers can move fast, and the bike makes escaping them much easier. Deacon's role in his biker gang is referenced in his description too. The mongrels all have patches that indicate they are 1%ers, marking themselves as outcasts who deliberately exist outside the law. Days Gone was not a huge commercial success, although it did build a decent little fanbase. A sequel was pitched, but it was rejected, and director John Garvin was let go from Sony for... well, he wasn't nice, let's put it that way. Bend Studio are currently working on something new, although we don't yet know any details. After the success of Journey, Sony's support studio in San Mateo sought out more small developers to work with. As a way to achieve this, they supported a game development program at Carnegie Mellon University, which would eventually result in 6 students being hired. With 3 more students from San Jose State University, along with a couple of industry veterans, Sony formed Pixel Opus, who would release their first game, Entwined, in 2014. The game was mainly an art piece where players controlled 2 souls that could form a dragon when brought together. It received mixed reviews, but led to the development of the studio's second title. Inspired by street art from India, as well as the graffiti portions of Jet Set Radio, the team built a game around painting. The game would eventually release in 2019 as Concrete Genie, where a boy named Ash gained a magical paintbrush that would bring his art to life. Using this brush, he works to paint the town of Denska with the assistance of painted beings known as genies, slowly revitalizing the town with their magic. Along the way, he has to contend with a group of bullies who are determined to get in his way. Ash appears in Astro Bot as the magical graffitiist. All of his descriptions and his brush reference the central gameplay mechanic of the original game, where Ash paints various designs along walls. This is used to activate strings of light which brighten up the town. By painting genies, Ash can gain their guidance on specific things to paint, which grants him super paint powers that can be used to remove corruption from walls. His animations also reflect the creation of genies, as he holds his brush up to a wall pondering what to draw. When hit, he'll draw Astro, although sadly he will fade away after briefly coming to life. Concrete Genie was well received by critics on release as an interesting artistic title with some gorgeous visuals. Sadly, it was not a commercial success, and after only 2 games, Pixel Opus would be shut down in 2023. As mentioned, Metal Gear had made Hideo Kojima an industry legend, which is why there was a frenzy of excitement after Konami released a mysterious playable teaser for Silent Hills, a new Silent Hill game directed by Kojima, assisted by Guillermo del Toro, and starring Norman Reedus. And then, they unceremoniously fired Kojima and cancelled the project. But this was not the end for Kojima. Because Sony had generated a ton of excitement through announcing the teaser and making it exclusive to the PS4, they knew what they had to do next. They handed Kojima a big bag of money and told him to make whatever the hell he wanted. The result was Death Stranding, an experimental game made with a budget the most experimental artists in all mediums would kill to be given. You play as Sam Porter Bridges, played by Norman Reedus, who'd come along for the ride. He is a delivery man in a post-apocalyptic world where the fabric of reality is breaking, rain rapidly ages you, and ghosts haunt the now unrecognizable landscape. Everyone now lives underground and society has crumbled, and only porters like Sam are able to keep the world connected. The game was mostly delivering packages to different clients around a barren open world, while you managed Sam's health and well-being. It starred countless celebrity friends of Kojima, and its story was a dense, high-concept narrative about the nature of community and the ways it can be broken or repaired. Sam appears in Astro Bot as the patriotic porter. His name references his role, but also how much of the game is about bringing the United States of America back together as one nation. His appearance as a bot features him carrying a large number of packages, something that is central to the game. Hitting Sam will cause him to wobble and shake, similar to when he would lose his balance in the original game. However, occasionally while he idles, the radar device on his shoulder will activate, and strange footprints will appear in the mud in front of him. This is a reference to the BTs, or beached things, ghost-like remnants of humanity that exist between the worlds of the living and the dead. They are typically invisible to the naked eye, but the radar will detect their presence, and the footprints are usually another sign that they're around. You want to do everything you can to avoid these things whenever possible. His gadget item is a baby. This is a bridge baby, or BB for short, an infant born from a brain-dead mother who also exists between the realm of the living and the dead, allowing those hooked up to it to detect the BTs. Death Stranding was a divisive game on launch, with some buying into its themes and weird gameplay with great enthusiasm, while others bounced off those same elements due to the game's experimental presentation. However, a sequel is on the way, and Kojima is seemingly being allowed to keep doing this, with other projects also in the works.
1, 2, 3. Dream.
With the success of Little Big Planet, Media Molecule wanted to take the creative goals of the game even further and give players a wider range of creative tools to mess around with. Their idea was to build a game where creation was the main focus, as opposed to Little Big Planet where play and create were essentially separated into two sections. They toiled away at their new creative sandbox for most of the 2010s, eventually releasing Dreams in early access in 2019, and the full game in 2020. Dreams was less a game and more a full creative suite that let players make whatever they felt like. There were coding tools, modeling tools, music making tools, and even more tools that could be used to make games. The game offered full freedom over these tools and even allowed players to share assets, meaning that different players could develop different aspects of a game and bring it together into one full collaborative project. This was made easy on a controller through the use of an imp, a cursor-like creator controlled by the player, and used for basically everything in the game. This imp represents Dreams in Astro Bot as the creative cursor. Both the name and the description represent the creative nature of the original game. The imp's behaviour in the crash site also does this more overtly, as it appears to be building a 3D model of Astro and is currently in the process of attaching the second arm. And that's really all there is to this bot. Dreams was an unusual idea for a game, but exactly on brand for Media Molecule. But while it did build a neat little community for itself, it sadly didn't last too long. In 2023, servers for the game shut down, and Media Molecule have confirmed they're focusing on a new, unannounced project. You can still buy the game and try and build stuff in it, but you will no longer be able to share it with others or access anything from other players. After the release of infamous Second Son and First Light, Sucker Punch decided to move onto another project, with a desire to develop a melee-focused open-world game. After toying with different historical settings, the team stumbled on the Mongol invasion of Japan, and found it an intriguing story to work with, and so, Ghost of Tsushima went into development. The team flew out to spend time with historians, assisted by team members from Japan Studio, and this helped shape a historically accurate setting. However, the team still decided to take some liberties, such as Jin's armor being based on anachronistic Sengoku period armor, as it looked more like what players expected the armor to look like. Similarly, the samurai code that's central to the game's plot was taken from Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, rather than any historical document. The game focused on Jin Sakai, a high-ranking samurai serving under Lord Shimura. During the Mongol invasion of Tsushima Island, the local samurai quickly find themselves overrun by the underhanded techniques of the invaders. Jin, wounded physically and spiritually, finds himself teaming up with a thief named Yuna, whose techniques prove useful against the Mongols, although they violate his own personal military code. The game sees Jin become the Ghost, a samurai who has rejected his code and rank in service of saving the people of Japan from the invaders. The game was an open world where the wind guided Jin around Tsushima Island, and where combat could take the form of brutal and tense melee standoffs, or Jin using tactics similar to a ninja, with players free to switch between techniques as they saw fit. In addition, the game's open world saw Jin commune with nature, visiting fox shrines, and writing haiku in natural environments. With Sucker Punch's reputation as one of Sony's key first-party developers, Jin Sakai is inevitably in Astro Bot. He's the vengeful spirit, a reference to his new title as the Ghost, although he himself is not a literal spirit. His description references how, in order to save his people, he had to sacrifice his rank as a samurai and operate from the shadows. However, despite the rich narrative and the brutal combat that mark what Ghost of Tsushima is, it's represented in Astro Bot with hot springs. The Jin bot sits naked in a hot spring enjoying the peace. In Ghost of Tsushima, the hot springs were a side activity where Jin would reflect on events in his life. And yes, he was definitely naked, because you even get to see his butt. Apparently that was the most important part of Ghost of Tsushima from Team Asobi. Interesting. Ghost of Tsushima proved to be a big hit, with even Japanese players praising the depiction of their history from the perspective of a Western studio. A sequel is in the works, set centuries later, and starring a new character set to gain the Ghost title, Ghost of Yotei. During a meeting in 2018, Mediatonic designer Joe Walsh started thinking about game shows. More specifically, he was thinking of 3 game shows, all of which were popular in the UK at some point. It's a Knockout, Takeshi's Castle, and Wipeout. No, not that one. Immediately, he got to work pitching a project based on the concept for the studio to work on. He wanted to make a battle royale inspired by the kinds of ridiculous games played on those shows, and pitched it as the Fool's Gauntlet, which would become Stumble Chums, and later, the final title, Fall Guys. Inspired by the ridiculous costumes of It's a Knockout, the characters in this game show became adorable bean people. Based on an ethos of balancing the playing field and because seeing people falling over is funny, the beans were under the influence of ragdoll physics that caused them to wobble and flop over. The game saw these bean people head off into a variety of game types, most of which involved not falling off into a void, whether it's because it put you behind in a race, or because it was an instant elimination. 60 players raced across goofy obstacle courses, played a variety of sports and minigames, or simply tried to knock each other off platforms. Each round saw a set number of eliminations, until eventually one final race saw players competing to grab the crown at the end. The game was a huge hit, not least because its initial release saw it launch for free for all PlayStation Plus subscribers, meaning the game was heavily populated on day one. The exclusivity deal that led to that is clearly the motivation for one of the beans showing up in Astro Bot. This bot is the Clumsy Bean, a reference to how floppy the beans are in the original game, often stumbling over each other without a care in the world. Its description states that it can overcome all obstacles, which indicates that this specific bean has made it through a few rounds, jumping over obstacles and keeping ahead of the pack. Its gacha item is the Dizzying Disc, one of the many spinning platforms that shows up in Fall Guys. This could either be one of the rotating platforms located in a standard obstacle course, or it could be one of the platforms you could be knocked off in an elimination event. Most likely the former though. If you hit the bean, it'll go flopping around on the wheel for a bit, referencing the original game's ragdoll physics. On its release, Fall Guys immediately encountered problems because its servers were getting massively overloaded because of how popular it was. The game was a massive hit out of the gate and has seen countless updates ever since. A year after release, Epic Games bought Mediatonic, causing the game to change hands from Devolver Digital and moved to a free-to-play model in June of that year. Since then, the game's player count has reached 50 million and is still going strong to this day. After spending years on smaller, more arcade-style titles like Resogun, Housemarque were looking to do something more ambitious for the PS5. This resulted in the development of their first AAA game, a game that would take 4 years to produce and would eventually be revealed alongside the PS5 and prove to be a flagship title early on. That game was Returnal. Returnal stars Celine Vassos, an astronaut who is investigating a mysterious signal known as the White Shadow, which leads her to crash land on the planet Atropos. Here, she is shocked to find her own corpse, and quickly learns that she is trapped in a time loop where every time she dies, she returns to where she started. With no other choice, she investigates deeper into the planet, looking for a way home and to escape the time loop. The game, at its core, is a roguelike, where the gameplay elements are justified within the story. Every loop sees progress reset while the environment changes shape on each loop. The goal is to survive the onslaught of alien creatures and get deep enough into the planet to discover its secrets and the harsh truths lying at its core. Celine is in Astro Bot. More specifically, she is one of the additional bots who can be obtained in Astro's Playroom ahead of the game's release. Her unlock method, character description, and interaction in the crash site all relate to the game's central premise. In order to unlock Celine, you have to intentionally die to a group of enemies while standing in a certain spot. Her character description mentions breaking the cycle, which is the cycle of death and resetting, and when hit, she will collapse on the ground with a broken spacesuit before reawakening, much like happens when she dies in Returnal. One final detail that features in Celine's design is the astronaut doll that she holds the whole time. This is a reference to a mysterious astronaut character that shows up in the game's story, whose identity is slowly unraveled as the game progresses. Returnal proved to be a big success when it launched in 2021. It won countless end-of-year awards and was praised highly for its unique take on the roguelike genre and its surprisingly deep story. It's not one of the PS5's biggest sellers, but it has gained a cult classic status among many. What its lasting legacy is, remains to be seen. Ember Lab is an animation studio founded in 2009 by brothers Mike and Josh Greer. They produced a wide portfolio of work, mostly in the commercial space, until 2016, when they produced a fan film based on The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask called Terrible Fate. After the film went viral, the brothers decided the next logical step was to create a video game of their own. The Greer brothers gathered a team with game dev experience, and once they'd recruited a crew of around 15, they built a game around Southeast Asian culture. Sony took an interest in the project, providing additional funding and marketing in exchange for an exclusivity deal. The game would eventually be revealed alongside the PS5 in 2020 as Knack, Bridge of Spirits. The game would eventually release for the console a year later. The game starred Knack, a spirit guide who helps spirits move on to the afterlife by dealing with their unfinished business. She journeys to a mountain village in search of a fabled shrine, and here she finds an abundance of spirits who need her help. In turn, she is helped by the Rot, adorable fuzzy creatures that help bring balance to the forest. The game was an action-adventure that mixed puzzles with some light Souls-like combat. Knack journeyed through the various parts of the mountain, solving challenges along her way, and using her staff and the power of the Rot to calm the angry spirits that threaten to corrupt the land. Knack shows up as the spirit guide in Astro Bot. Her name, description, and item description all reference her role as a spirit medium, tasked with helping restless spirits move on. The story of Knack features several of these spirits, each of them with their own tragic stories. While some spirits can be moved on gently, others have become corrupted beasts and must be fought to calm them down. Her gadget item is the shape-shifting staff, her primary weapon of choice throughout the game. While it could be used as a bludgeoning weapon, it was also used to cast spells and could be turned into a bow, hence the shape-shifting part of its name. Knack can be found meditating in the crash site in Astro Bot. This is a reference to the meditation spots that can be found throughout the world. By using these, Knack is able to increase her maximum health. Meditation also acts as a nice scenic break for the player too, as Knack sits quietly surrounded by her Rot buddies. The little guy pestering her during the meditation in Astro Bot is one of these Rot, and is more than likely the hero Rot, the first little guy that she finds in the game, and who helps guide her to his friends as the game progresses. As Kena finds more Rot throughout the game, the number following her at all times drastically increases. When you hit the Kena bot, a bunch of Rot tumble out of her, which is likely a reference to the little army that you can amass throughout the whole game. The way they disappear again is similar to how they'll often teleport around, and won't always be visible depending on how much action is going on. Kena Bridge of Spirits was a fun little game that won a decent amount of critical acclaim, mostly for its surprisingly tough combat and incredible animation. The game received numerous updates, including plenty of new hats for the Rot to wear. However, what Ember Lab plan to do next is currently unknown. In 2015, Ubisoft developers Cooler and Viv, not their real names, left the company to pursue an independent project. After sharing some early footage online, they attracted the attention of Annapurna Interactive, who wanted to fund the project. Inspired by the Kowloon walled city, the duo realised that the environments would make a great playground for a cat, and built the game around it. They also decided to contrast the organic nature of the cat with robotic NPCs, especially with their limited resources. The game was in development for quite a while, as the small team toiled away quietly, occasionally sharing work in progress shots via their HK project blog. However, it wasn't until 2020 when their game, Stray, was shown off to the world as a game for the upcoming PS5. And because people like cats, enthusiasm for the game was high. Stray released for the console and PC in 2022. You played as an orange cat who gets himself trapped inside a city populated by robots. Players could interact with the world in cat-like ways, jumping across buildings and climbing on air conditioning units, occasionally batting paint cans around and clawing random bits of furniture. But there was also a story here about the robot civilization that had formed in the city, while the humans who once lived there were long gone. The cat from Stray is the curious kitty in Astro Bot. He mainly sits around in the crash site being a cat. He will clean himself, stretch, chase a butterfly, and occasionally curl up to sleep. Many of these things are based on behaviours of the cat from the original game, with the sleeping being an activity players can actively choose to do whenever they feel like it. He also meows while doing these things, and it seems a lot like those meows are lifted from the original game, which allowed you to meow on command. He also gets a gacha item, unlike a lot of the other animal bots. This is the friendly drone, based on B12 from Stray. This drone allowed the cat to interact more usefully with the robot NPCs of the game's world. The two encounter each other early on, and B12 agrees to help out this feline stranger. Of course, this does require getting him to wear a backpack, and in typical cat fashion, he protests. Hitting the cat in the crash site will cause B12 to pop out and fly around. Stray was a popular game on release, and it releasing into PlayStation Plus helped a lot, as it proved to be one of the more popular releases in the service's history. Since then, the game has been ported to other consoles, gained a limited physical release and a soundtrack, and even helped raise money for real-world cat charities. It was also nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards. We're not sure what the developer's next plans are. Thar is a Japanese design firm with a wide, varied portfolio. You might know them best as the designers behind the fashion brand Uniqlo, but they've also worked on projects as diverse as music videos, art installations, and public toilets. But even those working for a wildly creative company such as this need a distraction at work sometimes, and designer Yugo Nakamura used some of his downtime to develop a unique visual project about fitting as many people as possible on a single screen. The company at large actually liked his project and decided to exhibit it at the Unity Festival in Tokyo. It could have just ended there as just a quirky art project, until Tetsuya Mizuguchi walked by. Remember him? He's the designer behind Rez and Space Channel 5, who we mentioned earlier. He saw the project and was fascinated by it, believing that Nakamura had the aptitude to turn the project into a video game. And so, Thar and Mizuguchi's company Enhance worked together to turn humanity into a game. Development began in 2018, but it wasn't until 2023 that the game saw a full release. Somewhere along the way, the game attracted Sony's attention, who made a deal for a year's console exclusivity for PS5 and PS4. Inspired by the movement of people at conventions, Nakamura designed a puzzle game about herding groups of people, guiding them to a higher purpose. And to achieve this, players take the role of a tiny Shiba Inu made of light, and by barking they can place directions for the humans to follow. It's a simple game in concept, but one that adds creative layers of complexity over time. The Sony exclusivity the game gained was seemingly enough to get humanity represented in Astro Bot. The Shiba influencer is the glowy pup controlled by the player, named for the exact reason outlined in its description. When it barks, humanity listens. In other words, the exact mechanics of humanity. You can also make the Shiba bark in the crash site by hitting it. There's also a strange orchestra hit noise when this happens too. But the closest I could find to the origins of this was the victory noise for collecting a Goldie. These were special giant golden humans who others would want to follow, who acted as an optional challenge for the player. Humanity was widely praised upon release, with critics all calling it an astoundingly creative puzzle game that kept throwing new, weird ideas at you. It also made several Game of the Year lists, including my own, where I placed it at 16. Weird Sony lives on, I guess. After their collaboration on Nioh and its sequel, Team Ninja and Sony had another project in mind, an open-world game set in the Bakumatsu period. A technical challenge for the developer, whose expertise was mainly in linear games, they nevertheless forged ahead and created Rise of the Ronin for the PS5. The protagonist is one of the Blade twins, part of the Veiled Edge resistance group, who witnesses their partner sacrifice themselves during a botched assassination attempt on Matthew Perry. The protagonist learns their partner may still be alive, so they fight their master the Bladesmith for the right to leave and pursue their quest to find them. This leads them to Yokohama, where they get involved in the complex web of volatile politics that was sweeping across Japan at the time, and discover some complicated truths. The protagonist of Rise of the Ronin was added to Astro Bot with the speedrun levels. Named the Masterless Samurai, this is a reference to the fact that they must defeat their master in order to leave for their quest. They can usually be found hanging out in the crash site, as a cat keeps trying to wriggle out of their robes. This is a reference to one of the game's key collectibles, cats. Throughout Japan you can find cats hanging around, and you can pet them. Finding them helps boost your bond with an NPC who can sell you items. When hit, the Ronin will fly up into the air and float around on a glider. This is an item you can find early on in Rise of the Ronin, and as the name implies, you can glide with it. This allows you a quick escape from a high area, which you will encounter a few of throughout the game. Rise of the Ronin received decent reviews and sold reasonably well too. However, this game is incredibly recent, so its lasting legacy remains to be seen. One of Sony's big pushes in recent years has been attracting emerging talent from Asian countries outside of Japan. Game development is growing in China and South Korea, and Sony have been there to scoop up exciting projects, whether that's console exclusivity for the works of MiHoYo, or more appropriately for us today, helping to fund a AAA game release from a Korean studio best known for a gacha game. Shift Up, developers of Nikke, first revealed their collaboration with Sony as Project Eve in 2019, before renaming it to Stellar Blade in 2022. The team enlisted the help of model Shin Jae-eun as reference for the protagonist, and sought monster designs from Hee Chol-jang, best known for works like The Host. The result was a combination of and a Souls-like, set in a post-apocalyptic Earth, where the remnants of humanity fight off terrifying monsters with the help of angels from space, such as Eve. Eve is the player character, a naive soldier sent to battle the Natiba for humanity's salvation, only to learn some dark truths about her mission along the way. Stellar Blade was a big hit on its launch in 2024, providing a major exclusive for the PS5, and Eve proved popular as a character too for, a few reasons. It's not surprising then that Eve has been added as a late addition to Astro Bot. She is the ponytailed protector, a reference to her role as protector of humanity from the Natiba, and also to her absurdly long ponytail that she uses to store her sword. No, really, that is where she puts it. Her description states that her combat skills are stellar, which is a clear reference to the name of the game, and also the wide array of combat skills that she has in the game. Her gacha item is the faulty dispenser that requires a little encouragement. She can be seen attacking this vending machine, trying to get something out of it once you've unlocked it. This vending machine is the same model as the ones seen at the various camps across the world of Stellar Blade. They are all inert when you first encounter them and need to be reactivated, which is easily done by slotting in a coin. However, some camps require you to complete a specific side quest before they become available, which this could also be a reference to. Once activated, these vending machines can dispense items that you can use within gameplay. Eve never attacks these vending machines though, and certainly not as forcefully as her bot version. Other broken vending machines can be investigated, but all Eve does is give them a light kick. She doesn't throw herself at the machine like her bot version does. When her bot version is hit, cans will drop out of the machine and Eve will drink happily from them. While there aren't many instances of her drinking like this in Stellar Blade, her excitement over the cans could be a reference to the collectible cans found throughout the game. These represent a range of fictional drink brands, and Eve has a weird fascination with them. Stellar Blade has been a hit, like I said, with many praising it for its combat and its visuals. It's too early to say what its lasting legacy is at this point though, as it has really only just come out relatively. And that is every single VIP bot covered, except for one. You know, it's only fair that we take a quick look at the history of Astro himself, as he's been around for longer than you might expect. In 2012, a small team was formed within Japan Studio specifically to develop tech demos for Sony systems. Led by French developer Nicolas Doucet, who'd previously worked at London Studio, they gained the name Team Asobi, the Japanese word for play. Their first task was a tech demo for the PS4, a pack-in game meant to show off the features of the PlayStation camera and the DualShock 4. The Playroom featured a number of AR minigames, all of which required the use of the PlayStation camera. These minigames included one called AR Bots, which was all about a bunch of tiny robots who live in your controller. They would then go on to star in a DLC for the game, where one of these robots became a ninja in an endless runner game. The concept would then be expanded further with the release of the PSVR as the Playroom VR in 2016. Once again, another minigame collection, and the bots returned once again for a game called Robots Rescue. And this time, Team Asobi added blue highlights to one of the bots, elevating him to the role of protagonist and placing him into a platformer adventure where he had to go and save his friends. This might start sounding familiar. This would prove to be immensely popular with players, and Team Asobi decided to expand this out into a full game. 2 years later, PSVR would gain Astro Bot Rescue Mission, which gave our boy his name and expanded the simple platformer minigame into a full-blown experience. It won huge amounts of critical acclaim for its charm, imagination, and joy. The principle remained the same, with Astro heading across the universe to save his robot friends. However, the VR exclusivity of the game meant it didn't catch wider attention. But Team Asobi were clearly not done with the character. As a studio whose bread and butter was in tech demos, their next task was to develop a tech demo to show off the DualSense controller for the upcoming PS5. However, after Rescue Mission, it was clear that Team Asobi didn't just want to make another minigame collection. They stuck with Astro and developed a short 3D platformer built around him as his antics showed off what the controller could do. That game was Astro's Playroom, a pack-in game for the PS5. Due to the launch of the new system, Asobi decided to turn the game into a celebration of PlayStation itself, a way of celebrating the past while demonstrating the future. Instead of other bots, Astro now retrieved bits of historical PlayStation hardware, with each of the game's 4 levels providing hardware from a different generation, much like these 4 videos. You could also find bots in the levels acting out scenes from other PlayStation games. This surprise little game won people over once again, and demands for another full-fledged game built off all of this flooded in. And in 2024, that game released as simply Astro Bot. It took the concepts of both Rescue Mission and Astro's Playroom and combined them into a big adventure for our little bot hero. It launched with a special event held within Astro's Playroom, where you could rescue 4 bots that would then transfer over to the new game, who I've talked about in this series, and a countdown where a basement room filled with bots eagerly awaiting the new release. And that is where we are today. Astro Bot would go on to receive great acclaim from across the industry, even winning Game of the Year. Astro has cemented himself as the new mascot for PlayStation, and all eyes are now on Team Asobi to see what they can come up with next. And with that, everyone has been covered. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I would love to know once again what your favourite bots have been and who you feel should have been added. Please like and subscribe, and if you've really enjoyed what I've been doing here, why not donate to my Patreon and support any future videos I do? I would really appreciate it. Thank you for watching.